Hello, and welcome to the World War Lab channel. On November 29, 1943, more than 300 B-17 flying fortresses pushed their way into German airspace, bound for the industrial city of Bremen. Among that massive formation was a bomber with a hand-painted name on its nose, Rikki Tikki Tavi. Deep in the rear of the aircraft, a 19-year-old staff sergeant named Eugene Moran knelt behind a pair of twin .50 caliber machine guns in the tail position. Over the intercom, he cracked a grin no one could see and said, "Get your cameras ready, boys. I'm going to light it up like Christmas." The pilot replied calmly, "That's your ship, Rikki." Rikki Tikki Tavi was flying its fourth combat mission. By the time the bomb load was released over the target, the bomber had already begun to lag behind the rest of the formation. Isolated against the pale sky, it became a solitary mark. German fighters came in relentless waves. Bf-110s launched rockets that tore into the fuselage. Then Bf-109s and Fw-190s swarmed in from every direction, slicing through the air. Moran fired back from the tail, his guns hammering steadily. One by one, the voices on the intercom disappeared. 8 of the 10 crew members were killed. The navigator managed to bail out through the forward section. Moran was left alone, the only living man still inside the aircraft. Then a German flak shell struck the fuselage with catastrophic force, splitting the bomber apart. The forward section, wings, engines, and cockpit sheared away and fell. The tail section, a 12-ton mass of aluminum with no wings, no engines, and no flight controls, continued moving forward through the air. Moran was still inside it. He tried to force open the escape hatch, but twisted metal had jammed it shut. His parachute had been damaged in the attack. There was no way out. The tail section began to drop. For miles below lay the German countryside. Moran had no ability to slow the fall, no way to steer, no way to jump. He was trapped inside a fragment of wreckage, plunging through 28,000 feet of open sky. And then he did something that should not have been possible. But that comes later. To understand how a man could end up alone inside a falling piece of an airplane, you first have to understand the position he was assigned to. The tail gunner on a B-17 occupied a space that most people would not willingly enter on the ground, let alone 5 miles above the Earth in -60-degree temperatures with enemy fighters closing in from behind. It was the most isolated position on any Allied bomber. The tail gunner could not see the rest of his crew. He could not reach them. He could not touch another human being for the entire mission. The only way in or out was a narrow crawl through the length of the fuselage, past the waist gun positions, past the ball turret, and across the bomb bay catwalk. Once inside the tail compartment, the gunner was sealed off from everything except whatever approached from behind. He was also the last crew member who could evacuate if the aircraft went down. Every other man was closer to an exit. To escape, the tail gunner had to crawl the full length of the aircraft just to reach a hatch. In combat, that crawl often made the difference between getting out and going down with the plane. The space itself was roughly the size of a phone booth. To reach the tail of a B-17, a gunner began behind the cockpit, squeezed past the radio room, and then crossed a narrow catwalk suspended over the open bomb bay, 9 inches wide, with nothing below but the bay doors and a long fall to empty sky. After that, he pushed through the waist gun section, where 2 gunners stood at open windows, and finally ducked into a tunnel that led to the tail compartment. The space waiting for him was about 4 feet wide. There was no chair. Instead, the gunner knelt on the floor and leaned back against a small bicycle-style seat that took some of his weight. His legs folded beneath him, knees pressed hard against cold metal. Directly in front of his face were 2 M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 565 rounds of ammunition. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. The barrels pointed backward through a small opening covered by a sheet of plexiglass. That plexiglass was the only barrier between the gunner and the sky behind the plane. It was not armor. A single 20mm cannon shell would pass through it without slowing. There was no room to stand. If the gunner was taller than 5'10", his helmet scraped the ceiling. His shoulders brushed the sides. Oxygen hoses, intercom cables, heated suit wiring, and parachute harness straps crowded the space even further. The parachute itself was too bulky to wear and was stored nearby, theoretically within arm's reach, though in reality grabbing it under fire was another matter entirely. Once in position, the tail gunner was completely cut off. He could not see a single member of his crew. The nearest man, the closest waist gunner, was more than 20 feet forward, around a bend in the fuselage, hidden behind equipment racks and ammunition boxes. Communication existed only through the intercom. If the intercom failed, the tail gunner had no way of knowing what was happening to the rest of the aircraft. A veteran tail gunner named Carl Turner, who flew with the 15th Air Force out of Italy, completed 35 missions in a B-17 nicknamed Quiet Vengeance 2. Every mission, he crawled through the same tunnel, lowered himself onto the bicycle seat, and connected his oxygen mask and heated suit. Turner described himself as a loner, and the isolation did not bother him. He felt at home in the tail. His first combat mission, however, was not with his own crew. Standard procedures sent rookie gunners up with experienced crews on their first flight over enemy territory. Turner flew with strangers on a mission to Munich. He had never seen combat before and questioned whether he was ready. As the formation crossed the Alps and neared the target, the sky filled with flak bursts, thousands of black clouds of shrapnel detonating at altitude, each one hurling hot metal in every direction. Turner survived that mission. He would survive 34 more. But comfort in the tail was always relative. The same isolation that suited a loner also meant something else. If the aircraft was hit, if an oxygen line was severed, if the heating system failed, the tail gunner dealt with it alone. No one was coming to help him. The rest of the crew was too far away, the fuselage too narrow, the equipment too tightly packed. In an emergency, the tail gunner's first instinct could not be to call for assistance. It had to be to fix the problem himself, with numb fingers, in near darkness at 25,000 feet. At that altitude, the cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was a weapon. The B-17 was designed to operate between 25 and 30,000 feet. At those heights, the outside air temperature dropped to -50 or -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The aircraft was not pressurized. It was not heated. The fuselage was little more than an aluminum tube, with open gun ports in the waist section where air blasted through at 180 miles per hour. In the tail, the plexiglass panel behind the guns offered minimal protection from the slipstream and none at all from the cold. The temperature inside the tail compartment was essentially the same as outside. At -60, exposed skin could freeze in less than a minute. Metal became dangerous to touch. Bare skin would bond to it instantly. A gunner who stripped off a glove to clear a jammed weapon had only seconds before frostbite began to set in. The .50 caliber Browning machine guns jammed often. Clearing a stoppage meant working the charging handle, reseating the ammunition belt into the receiver, and sometimes physically yanking a spent casing loose. All of that required bare fingers, or at best thin silk glove liners. Every jam turned into a race between the malfunction and the cold. The solution was supposed to be the electrically heated flight suit. It was a one-piece coverall with fine wires sewn into the fabric, connected to the aircraft's electrical system through a plug mounted in the fuselage wall. General Electric developed the technology, borrowing the engineering from an unexpected source: electric blankets. Before the war, G had built a device known as the Copperman, a mannequin used to test heated bedding. The same wiring principles were adapted for flight suits, gloves, and boot insoles. On paper, the system kept crewmen warm enough to function at altitude. In reality, it was unreliable. The wires were delicate. Normal body movement bent and fractured them. One broken connection could shut down heating to an entire arm or leg. Worse, damaged wiring did not always simply fail. Sometimes it short-circuited and burned the man wearing it. Temperature controls were crude and inconsistent. Some airmen overheated until they were soaked in sweat, only for that sweat to freeze when the suits suddenly stopped working. Others felt no heat at all. By 1943, as many as 75% of frostbite cases among American bomber crews were traced not to exposure or poor preparation, but to electric flight suits that failed at the worst possible moment. Carl Turner flew his missions out of southern Italy and later described the cold at altitude as constant and inescapable. Heated suits did improve as the war went on. Later versions had better wiring and adjustable controls, but they never became fully dependable. On missions lasting 10 or 12 hours, a suit failure halfway through meant hours of exposure with no backup option. The tail gunners suffered more than most. Waist gunners at least worked in pairs. If one man's suit failed, the other could see it happening and help. The ball turret gunner was cramped and vulnerable, but he was enclosed. The pilot and co-pilot occupied the most insulated section of the aircraft. The tail gunner was alone. If his suit failed, no one knew. If his oxygen line iced over and airflow stopped, no one would notice until someone tried to reach him over the intercom and got no response. By that point, at that altitude, he would already be unconscious. The cold could kill quietly. German fighters did not. And they had a very specific reason for aiming at the tail first. The story of why German pilots targeted the tail gunner is also the story of how that position reshaped aerial combat over Europe. But to understand that, we have to go back to 1942. When American heavy bombers first began appearing over occupied Europe, the Luftwaffe attacked them from behind. It was the obvious approach. A fighter closing from the rear matched the bomber's direction of travel, which meant a lower closing speed and more time to aim. The attacking pilot could settle in, line up the shot, and fire long, steady bursts into the fuselage. Against early B-17 models, it worked. Rear defenses were weak. That changed with the arrival of the B-17E. Boeing added a dedicated tail gunner position, armed with 2.50 caliber Brownings covering the rear arc. The first German pilots who approached the new model from behind were met with a wall of concentrated fire they had not expected. Respect for the tail guns developed almost immediately. That single position forced the Luftwaffe to completely rethink how they attacked American bomber formations. One German pilot later remarked that attacking a B-17 from behind felt like trying to embrace a porcupine that was on fire. The danger was not just one tail gunner. A formation of 36 B-17s flying in a combat box could bring roughly 700 defensive machine guns to bear on an attacker. Coming in from the rear meant flying into overlapping fire from tail gunners, waist gunners, and ball turret gunners all at once. Luftwaffe analysts calculated that destroying a B-17 from behind required around 20 direct hits from 20mm cannon shells. Given the average German pilot's hit rate of about 2%, that meant firing nearly 1,000 rounds to bring down a single bomber from that angle. From the front, the math changed completely. The B-17's nose was its weakest point. Armor was thinner. Fewer guns covered the forward arc. And the head-on closing speed, often over 500 miles per hour, gave bomber gunners almost no time to react. From the front, 4 or 5 well-placed shells could destroy the aircraft outright. The Luftwaffe adapted. They developed a tactic the Americans called 12 o'clock high. Fighters attacking head-on from a slightly elevated angle, diving through the bomber formation at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. The engagement window lasted barely 2 seconds. It demanded precision, nerve, and a willingness to fly straight into the formation. The best German pilots scored kills this way. Average pilots often missed entirely, but even so, the tail was never truly safe. German units also developed a specific pattern known among American crews as the tail gunner's headache. Fighters positioned themselves on both sides of the formation about 2,000 meters out, then took turns diving at the rear of the bombers roughly 10 seconds apart. After each pass, they rolled away and split off. The attacks came in rapid sequence, each from a slightly different angle, designed to overwhelm the tail gunner with more targets than he could track at once. Later in the war, a new threat appeared: heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s fitted with additional cockpit protection and devastating 30mm cannons. These aircraft pressed their attacks to within 150 meters before firing. At that distance, a single 30mm shell could rip apart a control surface or kill a crewman instantly. The tail gunner became the priority target. German pilots knew that a motionless tail turret, guns no longer tracking, meant a bomber that had already lost its rear defense. That aircraft immediately became the focus of the entire formation's attack. The contest between the tail gunner and the fighters behind him lasted the entire war. Tactics shifted. Weapons evolved. Formations tightened and loosened. But the equation never changed. The tail gunner sat at the point of maximum exposure, facing whatever the enemy chose to throw at him from the sky behind. Enemy sent, armed with 2 machine guns and only a few hundred rounds standing between him and everything approaching from behind the aircraft. The question was never whether the position was dangerous. That was obvious. The real question was how long a man could survive in it. The numbers were unforgiving. When a crew joined the 8th Air Force in England, they were told their combat tour consisted of 25 missions. Finish all 25 and you went home. On paper, it sounded achievable. In reality, it was anything but. In 1943, the statistical chance of completing a full tour was roughly 1 in 4. 3 out of every 4 crews would be shot down, killed, or captured before reaching mission number 25. The odds improved somewhat in 1944 after long-range P-51 Mustang escorts began accompanying the bombers deep into Germany. Even then, the numbers remained grim. The 8th Air Force suffered more casualties than any other command in the American military during the Second World War. 26,000 men were killed in action. Another 28,000 became prisoners of war. In total, 4,754 B-17s were lost in combat, 37% of the 12,731 flying fortresses ever built. 1 out of every 3 B-17s produced in American factories never returned. For the British, the toll was even worse. RAF Bomber Command flew primarily at night, which reduced fighter attacks but offered no protection from radar-guided flak. The statistics for every 100 men who joined Bomber Command tell the story clearly. 51 were killed on operations. 9 more died in training accidents and crashes in England before ever reaching enemy airspace. 12 became prisoners of war. 3 were seriously wounded. 1 managed to evade capture. Only 24 survived unharmed. In other words, 3/4 of everyone who joined Bomber Command was killed, captured, or wounded. Among the dead were approximately 20,000 rear gunners. That figure was documented by the Yorkshire Air Museum. 20,000 men who died in the most isolated position on the aircraft. The average age across Bomber Command crews was just 21. The tail gunner's odds were shaped by a simple mechanical reality. He was the last man who could get out. In an emergency, loss of control, fire, or structural failure, the crew bailed out through hatches in the forward and middle sections of the aircraft. The pilot and co-pilot could exit through cockpit windows or the forward hatch. The bombardier and navigator had a hatch beneath the nose. The waist gunners stood only a few steps from the main fuselage door. The ball turret gunner had to retract his turret and climb back into the fuselage first, which was dangerous, but at least possible with help from the nearby waist gunners. The tail gunner had none of that. To bail out, he had to disconnect his oxygen mask, unplug his heated suit, unbuckle his harness, retrieve his parachute from its storage position, clip it onto his chest, and then crawl forward through the narrow tunnel past the tail wheel assembly into the waist section to reach the nearest exit. In a stable aircraft, this took time. In a spinning, burning, or disintegrating bomber, it was often impossible. The centrifugal force of a spinning aircraft could pin a man against the fuselage walls. Fire could block the crawlway. Structural damage could twist the tunnel shut. More than 2,800 airmen were killed during training alone. not in combat, but during the routine practice of flying in tight formation. Wingtips collided. Aircraft stalled in turbulence. Crews died learning the skills they would need to survive missions they would never live to fly. The men who completed training, survived their combat tours, and returned home were statistical outliers. Finishing a full tour required not just skill and courage, but an extraordinary amount of luck. The right weather, the right position in formation, a flak burst exploding 10 feet to the left instead of 10 feet to the right. Some men had that luck. One of them was a 20-year-old from California who climbed into the tail of a B-17 named Full House and emerged on the other side 35 missions later. Lawrence "Larry" Stevens was a sophomore at Alhambra High School in Southern California when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He was too young to enlist. For the next year, he served as a volunteer air raid warden, walking his neighborhood after dark, knocking on doors, reminding people to turn off their lights. By 1943, he was old enough. He joined the Army Air Forces and was sent to gunnery school at Fort Myers, Florida, where he shot skeet twice a day. It was pleasant duty. Then a letter arrived from his mother. His older brother, Ernest, had been killed in action at Messina, Sicily. Stevens finished gunnery school. In December 1943, he was assigned to a 10-man B-17 crew and given the tail gunner position. He took to it immediately. Everyone else on the aircraft was close enough to at least one other crew member for conversation, even if only through the intercom over the roar of the engines. The tail gunner was alone. Stevens didn't mind. He knelt on the floor, leaned against the bicycle seat, and watched the sky behind the aircraft. His bomber was a B-17G named Full House. Stevens flew in the worst position in the formation, a spot crews grimly referred to as Tail End Charlie, the last aircraft in the wing, farthest back, most exposed, and the first target a trailing fighter would see during a rear attack. Full House took the hits first. On March 31, 1944, Stevens and his crew boarded the ocean liner Queen Elizabeth and sailed for England on a zigzag course designed to avoid German U-boats. By late April, they were flying combat missions. Their first mission encountered light flak and no fighters. That would not last. Over the next 4 months, Stevens flew missions over France, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. Full House bombed submarine pens, airfields, and V-1 and V-2 rocket facilities. They dropped supplies to French resistance fighters. On June 6, 1944, they flew over Normandy as the invasion beaches burned below. On one mission returning from Trzebinia, Poland, Stevens removed his oxygen mask at 10,000 feet and began to relax. Then he heard the pilot scream for the co-pilot to grab the controls. Full House lurched out of formation and began to dive. Stevens looked forward through the fuselage and saw smoke pouring through the aircraft. Somewhere inside, something was burning. The waist gunner, Gordon Langford, grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran forward through the bomb bay to fight the fire. He was not wearing a parachute. He sprinted across the 9-inch wide catwalk suspended over the open bomb bay doors with nothing on his back, nothing beneath his feet, and open sky yawning below him. Holding the fire extinguisher in his hands, he managed to put the fire out. On August 25, 1944, Larry Stevens completed his 35th and final mission. He was 20 years old. In just 4 months, he had flown from bases in England, Russia, and Italy. He had crossed occupied Europe dozens of times. He had spent hundreds of hours kneeling in the tail of Full House, alone, staring into empty sky, waiting for whatever might come up behind him. When Stevens returned to New York, a customs inspector glanced at the combat ribbons on his uniform and casually told him to go home and enjoy himself. Stevens didn't go home. He volunteered to fly again, this time as a tail gunner on a B-25 Mitchell in the Pacific, preparing for the invasion of Japan. The war ended while he was still in training. He returned to Alhambra and joined the fire department, where he served for 31 years. He later wrote a book about his war called It Only Takes One. He had beaten the odds. But not every tail gunner survived by simply outlasting them. Some survived by doing something the odds said was impossible. The man who fell inside the tail over Bremen was one of them. And what he did on the way down was not just an act of survival. It was an act of war. Eugene Moran was born on July 17, 1924, in Wisconsin. He grew up on his family's farm near Soldiers Grove, shoveling manure and working the fields. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Moran was 17. He waited until October 1942, the month he turned 18, and enlisted in the Army Air Forces. After training, he was assigned to the 96th Bombardment Group, 339th Bombardment Squadron, 8th Air Force. He was stationed at RAF Snetterton Heath in England. His aircraft was a B-17F nicknamed Rikki Tikki Tavi, after the mongoose in Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book. His position was the tail. Moran and his crew flew 3 missions without incident. The 4th was Bremen. On November 29, 1943, more than 300 B-17s launched toward the city. Rikki Tikki Tavi was among them. The formation reached the target. Bombardier Donald Curtis released the payload over Bremen. Then, as the aircraft turned for home, something went wrong. Rikki Tikki Tavi began to fall behind. It drifted out of formation and into open sky, alone and exposed. The Germans saw it immediately. A staffel of Bf-110s attacked first, armed with 21-centimeter mortar rockets designed to break up bomber formations from long range. Then the single-engine fighters arrived. Bf-109s and Fw-190s swarmed the isolated bomber from every direction. Moran fired from the tail. The waist gunners fired from the sides. It wasn't enough. One by one, voices vanished from the intercom. 8 men were killed. Only Moran in the tail and navigator Jesse Orison in the nose were still alive. Orison bailed out through the forward hatch. Moran couldn't follow. The tunnel leading out of the tail was blocked. His escape hatch was jammed shut by twisted metal. His parachute had been shredded by gunfire. Then a burst of flak tore through the fuselage and split the aircraft in 2. The forward section, cockpit, wings, engines, broke away and fell. The tail section, a 12-foot length of aluminum with no meaningful flight surfaces, separated cleanly and began to drop. Moran was still inside, surrounded by ammunition, wedged between his guns and the walls of the compartment. What happened next was witnessed from the ground and later confirmed after the war. As the tail section fell, spinning through the air, German Bf-109s continued to attack it. The pilots either didn't realize it was wreckage or mistook it for some strange new Allied aircraft. It appeared to be gliding under control. And Moran, trapped inside the tail of a destroyed bomber plunging from 28,000 feet, fired back. He trained his twin Brownings on the fighters making passes at him and squeezed the triggers. German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground also opened fire, adding flak bursts to the chaos surrounding the falling wreckage. Moran was shooting at German fighters while dropping 4 miles through the sky without a parachute. The tail section slammed into a tree in a wooded area near the town of Syke, a few miles south of Bremen. The impact threw Moran's head forward into his machine guns. He survived. His skull was cracked. Both forearms were broken. Several ribs were shattered. He was bleeding heavily. 2 Serbian prisoners of war who happened to be doctors saw the crash and ran to the wreckage. They pulled Moran out and treated his wounds. Later, at a prisoner of war camp, a Serbian surgeon fitted a metal plate over the exposed portion of Moran's skull. He spent the next 17 months in captivity. He was transferred between camps in Germany, Poland, and Russia. Between February and April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed, Moran was forced onto a 600-mile march with other prisoners. On April 26, 1945, American troops reached Bitterfeld, Germany, and liberated the camp. Moran weighed 128 pounds. He was not the only tail gunner who fell from the sky and lived. 3 months before Moran's fall over Bremen, and 3 months after it, another man rode a severed tail section to the ground. He did not have a damaged parachute. He had no parachute at all. On January 11, 1944, 21 B-17s of the 15th Air Force lifted off from Italy, bound for Piraeus Harbor in Greece. Sergeant James Allenby occupied the tail position of a bomber named Skippy, flying as part of the 2nd Squadron of the 301st Bomb Group. He had been in the Army since 1935 and transferred to the Army Air Forces in 1943. He loved the tail gunner position. It suited him. The formation climbed into heavy cloud cover. Visibility collapsed. Pilots could barely see beyond their own wingtips. Trailing squadrons followed procedure and altered course for 2 minutes to create spacing. It wasn't enough. 2 B-17s from the 97th Bomb Group flew nearly head-on into the 301st Formation. The collision set off a chain reaction. Aircraft, debris, and men began falling through the clouds. 8 B-17s were destroyed within minutes. 64 airmen were killed. 17 survived. It wasn't the enemy. It was weather and the impossible geometry of flying blind in formation. Allenby felt what he later described as a hell of a jolt. At 19,000 feet, the 12-foot tail section of Skippy was sheared cleanly from the rest of the aircraft. The cockpit, wings, and engines went one way. The tail went another. He was jammed between his 2 machine guns and several hundred rounds of ammunition. There was no room to. His parachute was close by, but there was no space to maneuver it into position or strap it on. The nearest escape hatch was damaged and pinned shut. There was nothing he could do. The tail section began to spiral. As it rotated, flashes of blue sky, green forest, and brown earth cycled past his vision. He had no way of knowing whether the rest of the aircraft was still attached. The spinning motion and the long duration of the fall made him believe the entire bomber was intact and corkscrewing toward the ground. Later, he estimated that the fall lasted somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes. From 19,000 feet, with the drag of a spinning tail section slowing the descent, that estimate was plausible. He prayed. He thought about his family. He had grown up on a farm in Kentucky, the 8th of 9 children. He told himself that in a few more minutes he would be dead. The tail section slammed into a cluster of trees on a mountainside. Branches snapped and bent, absorbing part of the impact. The wreckage came to a stop. He was alive. His chest ached, but he could move his arms and legs. He worked himself free from the belts of ammunition packed around him and located the bulkhead door. The escape hatch was still jammed, but he managed to crawl out through the opening. Standing on the mountainside, he looked around. There was no airplane, only a section of tail wedged into the trees, nothing else in sight. He picked his way from tree to tree down the steep slope until he reached a narrow trail. Rain began to fall. After several hours, he heard voices and called out. Greek civilians found him and took him to an Orthodox monastery, where priests were sheltering Allied servicemen. Of the 17 men who survived the mid-air disaster that day, he was the only one who did it without a parachute. After recovering, he returned to duty. He went back to the tail. He flew additional missions. When the war ended, he continued serving through Korea and later Vietnam. He eventually retired as a lieutenant colonel. After the war, he visited the families of every crew member who had died aboard Skippy. He later married Lorraine Linbury Suttle, the widow of Skippy's co-pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Henry Suttle. He wrote an autobiography titled I Fell 4 Miles and Lived. He died in 1999 at the age of 82 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Eugene Moran went home to Wisconsin. He married, raised 9 children, and returned to the life he had left behind on the farm. In 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove named a street in his honor. He died on March 23, 2014, at the age of 90. A friend named John Armster later told his story in a book called Tailspin. Larry Stevens went home to Alhambra and rarely spoke about the war. His neighbors knew him simply as a fire captain. It wasn't until decades later, when his granddaughter helped him write his memoir, that most people around him learned what he had done at the age of 20. The book carried a title that doubled as advice. It only takes one. 3 tail gunners. 3 different wars inside the same war. 1 beat the odds by flying 35 missions and walking away. 1 fell 4 miles inside a shattered airplane and kept fighting on the way down. 1 rode a severed tail through the clouds without a parachute and lived to serve in 2 more wars. None of them chose the tail because it was safe. They chose it, or it chose them, and they did the job. 20,000 rear gunners did not come home. If this video helped you understand what they went through, hit the like button and subscribe. Turn on the bell so you don't miss the next one. These stories deserve to be told, and every like and subscription helps more people find them. I want to ask you something. Of all the positions on a heavy bomber, the tail, the ball turret, the waist, the nose, which one would you have chosen? Or would you have chosen none of them? Tell me in the comments. And if you know the name of someone who served as a gunner in the war, a grandfather, an uncle, someone from your town, leave it below. Their names matter. They still do.